Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, everyone, to our second session of the first aid, psychological aid program for pandemic times, the psychosocial challenges. Today, we will have a biopolitics and mental health session. I am going to read a very brief introduction. The COVID-19 pandemic is making us question many things about biopolitics and mental health as well. This is a relevant aspect of the debate. We can see how we give guidance as to how to calm down or distract ourselves, what to do not to feel uncomfortable and to keep being optimistic. And the advice is nice, but we should not forget that in the meantime, while we get distracted doing other things, many of the pillars upon which our society lies upon are crumbling down. And this is happening in a very concerning way. Mental health is just being relaxed and chill out while the world is trembling, but it's adapting and coping. And it is a great honor for me to introduce two experts on the field on this matter. Ana Elena Barrios from the Human Rights Center San Mateo de Córdoba, who's here with us, and Dr. Jose Barchotegui from the Barcelona University, director of the Atenea Network. Both institutions, the Atenea Network and the Human Rights Fray Mateo de Córdoba Center, they are institutions who are sponsoring this diploma course. It is a great honor to have them with us today together. I am going to read a small bio of Ana Elena and later of Jose. Ana Elena is a psychologist. She has a master's degree on intercultural studies in Lyon, France. She also studies in social psychology, and she has a master's degree on supervision by the Community Center and the German Association of Psychosocial Surveillance. She's worked with migrants in different contexts for more than 16 years and in different places around the country. She has worked with relatives of people who have disappeared. And as of 2016, she's belonged to the team of the Fray Mateo de Córdoba Institute in the Psychological Legal Accompaniment. And she's co-authored different papers and research and methodological guides on the psychosocial approach. Jose Barchotegui is a physician at Barcelona University. He's a psychiatrist. He studied at Barcelona University as well. He is a professor at the Barcelona University, founding member and director of the Psychopathological Service for Migrants and Refugees at the Sant Fer Hospital in Barcelona. And as of 1994, he has, until the present time, he's been the General Secretary of the Transcultural Psychiatry Office of the World Psychiatry Association from 2011 until the present time. He is the one who, during the 1990s, described the Ulysses syndrome, which is the syndrome of stress that migrants suffer. So once again, it is a great pleasure where this is very historic because these two different approaches are now getting together and they have so many similarities that we will be exploring today. Today, we'll start with Ana Elena Barrios. You have 50 minutes, and after that, we will have a small Q&A, and later we will listen to the Dr. Barchotegui. So thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to meet once again, even if virtually in this edition. I have had the pleasure and the honor of having participated in other editions of this diploma course. It is always a pleasure to be able to come back and have these conversations with all of the different parties and see the reflections and see the evolution of the matter and how times have changed. We are undergoing some very tough times, very tough times indeed with the pandemic. And because of this, it is very important for us to stop for a while and reflect and think about what's going on and what should we do differently and why? So I believe that this is quite relevant nowadays, perhaps more than ever. Being able to have this collective thinking, this reflection, comes at a very timely manner. And this time around, when we're talking about the psychosocial challenges, well, it is a great pleasure, a great honor for me to introduce the psychosocial approach to the conversation and mental health from the psychosocial perspective. The psychosocial scope is the one that I have held in my practice. And so I am going to start sharing my presentation. Please let me know if there's a technical matter that I should be aware of. So everyone is now being able to see the screen. So please let me know if there are technical issues or anything that needs my attention. So I belong to the team of the Human Rights Center San Mateo de Córdoba. We are in Tapachula, Chiapas. And I say this because I know that the participants, well, there are many people from around the world. We are next to the Guatemala border. This is a very critical point for migration, the southern border of Mexico, not only of our continent, but of the world, because this is a border cross that encompasses different nationalities from different continents even. So I will speak about my experience from this place and from the honor of belonging to this great team, the Center of the Human Rights Center, Fray Matias de Córdoba. And I will be sharing reflections about what we're doing, how we are now understanding and making sense or trying to figure out how to defend the human rights of migrants from our perspective, our place in the world. So let us start by clarifying a distinction, or what is the difference rather between the psychosocial and the psychological. And I do this especially for the people who come from other disciplines, which I understand is most of the people. Very few psychologists are involved in this diploma course this time around. So I'll give this explanation, and also because the psychosocial approach or psychosocial care or accompaniment, at least in Mexico, it has become quite fashionable, somewhat of a fad. There are many practices that we name psychosocial accompaniment, psychosocial care, that mean different things. So it is important for us to start with the definitions, the basic definitions. Where does this come from? What are the roots? Where did this approach come from? So that is the first thing. Let us make a distinction that those are not synonyms. The psychological and the psychosocial are not synonyms. The way in which we have created the definition of the psychosocial approach at Fray Matias is the one that I present here. It is a particular way of analyzing reality and do the defense of human rights work by acknowledging the specific impact of structural violence. And it emphasizes the coping resources of the people, families, collective organizations, and communities to strengthen the organization and the collective transformation of the context. So in the bold letters, you will see what are the elements that we consider key and are very important for the psychosocial approach. And they have to do with the defense of human rights, and that this type of approach or scope, I'll explain a little bit of its history, the reason why it was created, and how it acknowledges, or rather it guides us to be able to acknowledge and see structures that we visualize and know that those structures are unfair, injustice structures, and they are the ones that keep inequality alive. The human disasters that we are now going through, many of them, come precisely from those unfair structures, unequal structures, and very violent ones. So this structural violence is something that pervades everywhere around the world, but in each place there are different ways in which they operate and wreak havoc and cause damage. We are all in different corners around the world, and you might be able to acknowledge the strongest or the most serious types of violence that you are witnessing around them, what is causing them, what they're triggering as well in your own context, in the context of everyone. So it is all about acknowledging that we are experts in our specific context. It's unique. The singularity of the context is very important for us. And this is related to the acknowledgement and to learn about the experience of others, the experience of each particular context, and those structural violences, and how they are embodied inside ourselves. And it has an effect in the bodies and the psyches of people, and each life and each body is different, it's unique and singular. And that is why that we need to look at the specific impact of structural violences in the body, in the psyche, and acknowledging that the subjects, they're not passive. We are not passive subjects. We, everyone, migrants, we are not subjects that are just passive, receiving the violence, but rather that there is a knowledge and their resources, and from the psychosocial, we name them, the resources, the coping strategies, the strengths that are developed from the collective experience, the different ways in which we move forward and survive in spite of the different attacks in the history of human beings. People have suffered, and today is no exception. So it's looking at the structures, the inequality, the violence, and being able to see how they're embodied, what is the impact, the effects of those structures in each context and in each person, in each subject, and how the subjects, the people, have their own resources to deal with, to cope, to move forward, which is something that many families, many peoples are doing when facing this unfairness and inequality. That is why we decided to say that the psychosocial approach cannot be divided from, or cannot be isolated from, the human rights perspective, because our intention is to be able to achieve a collective transformation of the context, from the context and for the context. So we'll look into this overlap between each person, family, community, what's individual, with their own history, background. When we speak about people, each personalities, that people who make decisions, take actions, have a body, have emotions, and that they converge within a larger context called society. The political context, the economic one, and the cultural context. And those are two dialogic realities, if you may. They touch upon one another and influence one another permanently. That is why the question is, how do we work with this transformation? Because it has to do with the decisions that we make individually and collectively, and the actions that we undertake. So the psychosocial approach, where does it come from? Well, it has its roots in different schools of thoughts, in different branches of human thinking and practices. It comes from the humanist psychology. It takes certain elements from humanistic psychology, the one that started from the 50s to the 70s. And here are some of the most widely known authors of the humanistic movement. Carl Rogers, Viktor Frankl, and the perspective of understanding human beings and how we understand the psyche or the soul or the things that happen within us. Feelings, emotions, everything that is related to who we are within our inner experience, within the machine, as some people said. We also take from community psychology, the one that was developed during the 1970s, and it is also influenced by popular education, the movement of educators and reflecting upon how we understand knowledge and the creation of collective learning, and how political learning is, and how teaching is a political act. This wonderful movement that has been and is still popular education. It is not only exclusively about learning about the reality. It is not about the subject, one that teaches and one that learns, as if they were separated entities, but rather we are all teachers and students at the same time. The Paulo Freire School of Thought. We're constantly learning from one another. Everyone, we'll have something to teach others and something to learn from others. And we do this through our human relationships. And how we do that is how we construct those human relationships. And there are many other important ideas that come from popular education, from the movement, and that we have adopted here in the psychosocial approach. The father of the psychosocial movement is the father of the liberation theory. And that first author, the one who sets the ground, was Ignacio Martín Baro. Ignacio Martín Baro was a priest, a Jesuit priest, who was killed in 1989 in El Salvador. During his last few years of life, he spent that time in El Salvador. And what he did is extremely important because he went back to psychology as a science, the social psychology, different branches of it, and he gives it a different interpretation based on the reality of the 1980 Salvador War. So he was looking at what was happening in El Salvador in the middle of the war, the wreaking of havoc, and in a very special way, he analyzed and he interpreted many different things. And it is very similar to other wars in Latin America. The US interventionism movement is also explored. There are many key elements of the war that are studied, but he was always looking from the perspective of the downtrodden, the people, the economic impact, how families were also affected by all of this. And psychology for him was not enough to explain things, to do things, to be able to have a full understanding of what was happening and how to respond to such a chaotic and brutal reality, such an atrocious world as the one of war. That's where he wrote this paper, which is suggested in the readings, War and Mental Health. This is a paper that I highly recommend. It's only 7 pages. Do read it because it places many of the Ignacio Martín Baro elements center stage. He questioned many of the elements of traditional psychology that had been written until then, and he reinterprets it to say we need a different type of psychology, one that is truly helpful for us to see and understand and act when facing this harsh reality in Latin America. Because importing models from abroad is not enough. It's not enough for us to be able to understand and respond to the very harsh and complex reality we are living. And even though this article was written in the 1980s, it is still very universal, still very current. If you read it with today's eyes, speaking about the Mexican context, obviously in a border town as I live in, we will be able to acknowledge many of those elements that are still present. And it is related to the social degradation in times of war and what's behind the interests that move, what's deep down within. One of the elements that he questions a lot is the subject of neutrality of psychologists, the so-called neutrality or objectivity of psychologists. He was against this epistemological standing. He said that to begin with, there's no neutrality, it doesn't exist, it's a fantasy. Believing that somebody can be neutral and fully objective is a fantasy. Believing that our thoughts, our ideas, and our actions, professional and personal, can be neutral is not true. We are always interpreting what we see, when we hear, from our own lenses. So, for those of us who are agents, who play a role, a professional role in the interaction with social relationships, we must become aware of what reality is, the one that we're using as a filter to see the world, the lenses that we use to act, to read things. And he speaks about this as an ethical challenge. It's also an epistemological one. The role of psychologists, mental health workers, social workers, not only social workers as a profession, but people who are interacting in society and have an impact in communities, we need to take a stand. We need to have a critical perspective, and we need to be aware of the impact of everything we do, our actions, our words in society. So he is totally against the concept of neutrality, the sepsis, you do need to have a political perspective, a stand. Psychologists do need to take a side, and we should not buy this idea that we, from our desk, by doing psychometric tests, we are doing a good work, and that's enough. And just by wearing a white robe, you are exempted from being affected by communities, because everything we do, we're always affecting others, impacting others. So it is important to be aware of where you're standing. And so the mental health concept of Ignacio Martín Baró comes from here. And well, Ignacio Martín Baró came up with this idea in the 1980s as one of the elements of popular education undertaken by the social liberation psychology, what I mentioned a while ago. It's all about questioning and saying that this reflection has to be grounded and has to be understood from each context. Each one in your own niche of the world, in your own trenches, you can better understand what's required in your own context. And this opens a large door to enrich social rights. This is where many experiences started happening, to systematize the knowledge by acknowledging that each organization, each collective, each one practicing social psychology will see certain key elements for the interpretation, but what we do about that and how do we make certain that the tools that start as an analysis become a transformational act. Well, that is quite the task that each one of us should work with. And so many rich materials have been created as of how the psychosocial approach has been grounded and landed and how it's been applied in different contexts, especially in Latin America. I gave you some authors who have written a lot about the psychosocial approach during the last few years and in different contexts. Carlos Martin Beristain, Pau Perez, The Gap, who is, it's actually a collective in Spain, and they collect many interesting experiences and they have a documentation center. And here in Mexico, we have the Luna organization that does the same thing. One of the ideas from the psychosocial approach and from popular education perspective is nobody has the ultimate truth. It's a continuous search and nothing is written in stone. There are no Bibles. We only have certain aids for us to be able to interpret with fresh eyes, with critical eyes, to do our own reflection of the what, why, and how we do our practice. Now let's speak about mental health. According to the World Health Organization, the WHO says about mental health that it is a state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and it is not only the absence of an affliction or a disease. And more specifically, in terms of mental health, it says that it's a state of well-being in which the person can carry out their skills and can face the normal stress of life, of working in a productive way and contributing to the communities. So in this article that I have recommended, the one that is on the platform now, Martin Baro says, yes, but here in El Salvador, it's not about people in Salvador. It's not that they are not capable of facing productive lives or they are not able to work. There's no work to begin with. The problem is that there's unemployment and there's precarious job and informal economies, going back to the WHO. In this positive sense, mental health is the foundations for individual well-being and the efficacious functioning of a community. And then the WHO says an environment of respect and protection to civil, political, socioeconomic rights is fundamental for the production of mental health. Without the safety and the freedom that is acquired by those rights, it is extremely difficult to keep a good level of mental health. So that is to say that even the WHO acknowledges that without those elements, those social elements, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to say that we will have good mental health. There are certain prerequisites for people to have mental health. Ignacio Martin Baro spoke about mental health, saying the following: it's not about a satisfactory functioning or non-satisfactory functioning of a person. It is about a basic nature of human relationships that defines the possibilities of becoming more human, humanization, that open for the members of each society and group or community. So the emphasis of the psychosocial approach is not placed on the individual alone, as many people think when we usually speak and say things such as, oh, mental health, yes. The first thing that comes to mind is the idea of it is an individual matter, an isolated manner, so it is the responsibility of each person. No, in the psychosocial perspective, we believe that it's a collective thing, and our emphasis should go into analyzing the relationships. It is extremely difficult for us to speak about individual mental health when the group of relationships is sick, when violence is affecting societies, when the different social-political violences are wreaking havoc. We cannot make the individual responsible for that.
That is why we have this concern And we have to focus our energies on criticism and solutions to provide the necessary solutions. So this is what the psychosocial approach is proposing. These are the different environments that a person has. It has the spiritual, the physical, and the emotional world. And this is related. We have this permanent connection and a permanent dialogue between all these different areas, between that is individual, what is familiar, communitary, and social. It is impossible to have something happen at the communitary or social level without this having an impact on the individual. As has been seen throughout these pandemics, what is happening today and how this is affecting us worldwide. And without any doubt, this alters the family life and the individual life also. And in a very optimistic way, we also need to think about this the other way around, considering that individual actions or actions that are created towards other people will also have an impact in the community and in the social aspect. And here we have a basic concept presented by Martin Barón, which allows us to understand and talk a lot more in detail about the psychosocial focus, which is the psychosocial trauma. Before this statement, before the work he carried out, well, the trauma basically comes from medical terms, because of a trauma received. And based on this medical language, we imported this term into psychology, and it is presented in psychology for the first time as this individual experience that will really mark the person or hurt the person. And Martin Baró goes one step further and says that everything that is hurting a person has been socially produced, which means the roots are not in the individual, but in society. This is something that is really branding a person. So the fact that a woman, for example, is forced to flee from her own country to save her life because she has suffered gender violence, brutal gender violence. She was almost killed by her spouse at that moment, The one that is physically affected is herself, yes, but that injury was created by this man. And if we go even a little bit deeper and we talk about the structure that has sustained this relationship of violence, we're going to find out that there are very in depth roots in society. And so, thousands of women who have to run away to save their lives and save their lives of the children undergo the same situation. And if we analyze this is not just a problem suffered by this woman or one woman or 100 women that are fleeing their countries. This is a problem with society, society as a whole, of what is happening. Why are we generating or creating this society or these relationships, And its nature itself is kept through different institutional associations or groupal associations. That's where everything is based on, in all of these structures that are violent structures, that are unfair, unjust structures, and from which all of these sort of situations stem from the situations that are being defined and that are really establishing or just branding life of people. So whenever we are in front of a migrant, what we are looking for from the psychosocial aspect is not the pathology that the migrant has, but mostly to understand the story, the history, the life that this person has, and what are the roots of that story that the person has. What are the structural roots of it? Why did this person have to leave his own community because he didn't have the possibility of studying or finding a job in his own community, and because his mother died because of a disease, because the hospital was 3 hours away from where they were living at. So when we analyze all of that, we can see the structures that exist behind these situations, the structures where there therein lies a responsibility of what is happening today. So with the situation we're living in today, right now we are faced with two very important psychosocial traumas. We have mass forced migrations. We already had those before this, and they actually had been increasing in the last years in the different regions. We've seen that a lot in the Mexican border, the southern Mexican border. And to that, we need to add everything related to the pandemics and COVID 19, which also causes a physical and mental health crisis. So we need to analyze what is in the root of all of that. What are those structural roots that really give birth to this crisis? Because actually what we're saying is that, I mean, regarding the health crisis, we already had that. There were many other crises that already existed, and we're going to talk about that more in detail. If we go to the roots of these crises, what we find are these social structures of power and oppression. The society itself is based on this unequal way of creating and building different relationships. And this unequal way has also developed these three different areas, which are colonialism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchal system. If we go in depth in order to understand really where all of these inequalities stem from, we can go to these roots, the basis of the roots, which are these three topics. And what is in play right now is what we're seeing right now are these structures that are hugely unequal. We can clearly see this image where we see inequalities in the right, in the access to right, to law. I like this because this is something presented by Oxfam that say that 1% of the population controls 46% of the world's wealth. And we even have an image there showing us, that it's not even enough for them because they always have perpetual need for wealth and accumulating things. So when we see this and when we analyze the lower part of the world, we see how everybody has to fight and share what is left over. And so that is why we have these stories. That is why we have thousands and millions of forced migrations, because we have these inequality in the division of the wealth worldwide. That's the root of all of these migrations. And these are forced migrations. It's not about just, oh, a woman who wanted to try something new and that's why she moved. No, I mean, most of these stories is not because of that, because by not having basic rights covered, like access to water, access to health, well, then we have to migrate. And so that is why we have these forced migrations. So, considering all the forced migrations that have occurred in our region and worldwide, we can see the roots of these same migrations. Here, for example, we have the clear image of an iceberg, it's very clear and can express what we want to say. We see that there are many elements here that are not visible to the naked eye and that need to be further analyzed with analyzing the situation to achieve an understanding of them. And there are other elements that are always there that are very quickly seen, for example, that national resources have been used by the government. There's a lot of oppression to women, children, and sexual diversity. There is an inequality in the distribution of wealth, as we saw in the previous image. There's a financial slavery of many countries from other countries, exerted from other countries, and all of this, which is the bottom of the iceberg, show that there is a lack of will from the financial and political elites to solve the problem of margination and poverty worldwide, and that leads to wars or internal conflicts that have been financed by them. You know, this is what we have under the water, and what we can see are societies that are torn apart by violence, that there's an impossibility of having access to social rights, and that there's a persecution just because of gender reasons, you know, the persecution of women, of children, and of sexual diversity just because, or the LGBT community just because of their existence. And so we say that we are undergoing then these two psychosocial traumas, and what would that create? What does that mean, or how is it related to what we are living in through in our countries and things that we see more clearly in the borders? Well, basically, is that we have some social political violence that do not let people have a dignified life. And regarding health crisis, which was already which already existed and is now more serious. Well, the issues that the governments were not establishing priorities and were not guaranteeing the right of the health of the people, you know, and this goes together with all the crises that were provoked by financial interests that have to do with the fact of who is controlling the food or access to nutrition, or who is controlling young food, for example, and how they can access them, and how they can have access to sugars and all of this junk food. And all of that has to do with public health systems that have been privatized and are not correct. And these also create social fibers that are broken. So we have migrations, mass migrations, and how do they respond to this? So instead of trying to solve these, they are really making them worse, you know, by having progressive closing and of the borders, or going beyond the borders. You know, when they say that they go beyond the borders, means that these countries that have this high concentration of resources are using those who are in the middle. Like for example, Mexico. Mexico has a large concentration of resources, and it's one of the countries where many migrate to, and so the other countries delegate the responsibility to certain countries like our country to have this control of the border, to become the migration filter, you know, and that's the role that we have been entailed with the Mexican immigration policy, and some things that we worked on for many years. In the case of Europe, for example, Turkey or Morocco has to do that. So that's the role that we're playing right now. The role that we have to play is to work on those with those countries that are closing their borders, you know, and we are when we are next to those countries, their way that they want to solve this is by forcing these third countries to do this, you know, by keeping their head up high and delegating the retention role to these other countries. So what are we seeing in the society? I mean, what is just visible here is that we have people and families fighting to have a very dignified, a good life in a new place. That is what these thousands of families are trying to do. We see families and people who have been broken by violence, but they managed to get out of it, and they're fighting to get a better life. And they are faced with an increase on racism and xenophobia. And this is also supported by official and institutional discourses where they say that the migrants are an enemy, the enemies of national security. And so they keep talking about and pronouncing this hate discourse, and making immigrants responsible of the crisis that they generated themselves, of this whole situation that we are living in. It's easy and quite popular to talk about or blame immigrants for the local tragedies that are occurring worldwide. And politically speaking, it is also very profitable to keep on saying these type of xenophobe, racist type of speeches, and always against the migrants. And we also have extreme issues from the lack of resources for migrants. And it's not like the media is saying, oh, the migrants are coming and all the migrants are have the disease. And so that's a discourse that the governments are saying so that they can find a way or somebody to blame, an easy person to blame for this, because this has to do with people who are living in the margin of society. And whenever there is a crisis, we have inequalities that exist between countries, but also that exist within the country. Mexico is the king of inequalities. We've had one of the most richest, wealthiest men in the world, and also 50% of the population living in misery and going hungry and trying to get daily food. And we have population dying because of hunger here. So obviously, these psychosocial traumas do not have the same impact. It all depends on who we're talking to. You know, it all depends if we've managed to do our job or we've managed to kept our jobs. If we studied in the university, if it's man, if it's a woman. So we all need to face all of this. So we have all of these inequalities, and these are expressed in many different ways. And the issue is that migrants, migrants are the ones that are facing all the inequalities. And so they are the ones that are very exposed to this health crisis and to the situation of this extreme marginalization or instability. So, based on all of this, based on what this health crisis is creating right now, and which is something normal, we have a normal reaction, which is fear. I think we've all had felt fear at some moment during this pandemics. We've been afraid for ourselves or for our dear ones, our relatives. And we are like that because that is what we're seeing. We have that risk of contracting the disease and dying. But the perverse aspect of that is that this fear is being used for to manipulate people, to reinforce this hate speech and social fragmentation so that we can build higher walls, physical and mental and spiritual walls can be built higher between people. So when fear is the main element in any moment of crisis, this turns out to be very, very dangerous because whenever we have a society that lives with fear, society itself can make collective decisions or can live under certain collective circumstances that could benefit only the few. So, whenever we have these fear this collective fear, the discourse is also strengthened. They fear of other people become the main mediator, and the higher the fear rate, the better. And then I become more distant and more indifferent to other people because I fear them and I don't want to be near them. And at the end of the day, well, who suffers all of the effects of these traumas? Well, obviously, we're all suffering from this one way or another, but it doesn't affect all of us in the same way. It doesn't affect us all in the same way. It all depends on the social position we're at and where we're living at. We're not living things in the same way. And the thing is to see how these exclusion policies or margination policies affect the bodies of the migrants, of the people themselves. And they are the ones who don't have anything regarding access to resources. And at the end of the day, they are the ones who suffer the rejection and undergo the need to run for their own lives, to cross a border, and to continue withstanding everything that comes their way. But we also have inspiring messages of all the migrants who are resisting and are fighting for this. Now, if we go back to the psychosocial focus, which is our main axis here, and I always like to express it or explain it with this image, the image of a tree that is picking up all of these main elements regarding what the psychosocial approach proposes as a way to analyze the reality we are undergoing, and that is based on looking and recognizing and analyzing structural violence. In our context, we see that all of this is creating a forced migration under with this context of a pandemic, under the context of a pandemic, and all of this is resulting in psychosocial impacts and also in different strategies people follow to face these issues. So these collective strengthens the knowledge that people have, their fight and the will and their courage that all of these women have to run every day with their children to save themselves and to save their children's life is quite admirable. And to understand also how they want to offer them a life without violence, a life that is much more dignified than the one that they had. And so that capability and strength to transform the history and transform the history of past generations, because her mother underwent the same thing, her grandmother underwent the same thing, but she was able to come out, to break a border, to cross the border and survive. That is quite admirable. That strength to transform the histories is quite admirable. So in this crisis context and the context of psychosocial traumas, we are faced with many challenges also and dilemmas. I just mentioned a couple here, but there are several of them and they're very strong, And going back to our mental health issue, just as Martin Barros said, mental health has to do with the relationships that we have. If there are any issues in those relationships, then how can we strengthen that relationship if we are always afraid of the other person? If we always want to be distant from another person? And I'm not saying about keeping our healthy distant right now, and getting closer to everybody. No, I'm talking about what can we do so that we are not breaking up the relationships even more, and so that we are not hurting our collective and individual mental health. And how can all recognize and work together as allies, both domestically and with international people, and how we can fight to get this health and this mental health in general. How can we overcome all of these borders, all of these mental borders, and make them smaller or even disappear? Uh, how can I break the pattern of the way that I'm analyzing other people when we have this discourse over and over about setting this fear and separating people, and that only reinforces this knowledge. You know, it's basically that knowledge of just save yourself and that's it. And historically, what has helped communities and societies is to work together in solidarity, not in silos. And here, for example, in Mexico, whenever we've had an earthquake, you know, in 1985 and recently in 2017, we saw the solidarity. And we know that solidarity is the one that helps us to be personally and socially better. So the answer is to find out how can we resist or forget all of that discourse that just separates us from people who are different to us. And Martin Barot actually gives us a hint here as to the answer to this dilemma we're faced with. So Martin Barot specifies that an urgent job is education on mental health, which means to shape and socialize so that our subjective aspirations, our group aspirations, and individual aspirations are guided towards the satisfaction of our true needs, which means to demand the things that really take us through the way of our own humanization and not to go through those paths that tie us to compulsive consumption, hurting many others and dehumanizing a lot of people. There will be healthy, free, and creative minds in our country if we all enjoy a social body that is a free, dynamic, and just and fair one. So that is a clue that Martin Barro is telling us on how to become more humanized, on how to humanize our ways, the way that we work, on how to humanize the reality in which we want to work with and what we want to transform. So this is an invitation by Martin Barro of what we need to do. What do I need to change? What do I need to transform so that I can become more human or I can start working on humanization in the different environments we're at, you know, as a psychologist, as the worker of an institution, as a member of a family, as a person living in the community. What do I have to do so that I can help all of the society in general? So this is the last one. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ana Elena, for the first part of your presentation. So we do have several questions. The first question is, what other readings would you recommend from Martin Baró, in addition to war and mental health that we already have here? That was the first question. Why don't I give you three questions? We have some 20 minutes for questions and answers. Well, 17 minutes for questions and answers. So the second question is, what happens when an immigrant becomes a human rights defender and starts working in the organizational environment in charge of defending the human rights? But he always feels that we do not have that inclusive type of view. What happens with their mental health? I mean, he starts becoming more indecisive and starts losing interest in defending human rights because they do not have that equality. So this was the third question, or that is the second question? That's the second question, but you know what? Why don't we try to answer these ones? Let me read the second question again. So just as a summary is, if an immigrant becomes a human rights advocate and they start working in the organizational environment, they find out that there are certain processes or tasks that are not considering gender equality, and then they become disincentivized and they don't want to work anymore. They lose their interest in defending human rights. I mean, what can we do? What happens with that person? And the third question. Okay, we have the books from Martí Baró. This is the second question. And the third one is, in the case of the migration from Venezuela, what are the countries that are paralyzing the immigration flow? Because now Ecuador and Panama require a visa to enter the countries, but the flow is going through other areas or other countries. Okay, those are the first three. Let's go with the last one. This last one, as I said, I'm not an expert in immigration for that region. So I'm more an expert for this region in the southern border of Mexico. And a moment ago, I was mentioning when I was making the comparison with Morocco and Turkey because it is impossible not to understand that comparison, and the similarities that exist between these countries. Countries that are neighbor of destination of immigrant destination, great immigrant destinations like the United States. Morocco happens also. It's right next to the European Union.
And so, speaking about the policies of at the border, in the case of Venezuela, well, actually, there I do not know what the dynamic is, or where we could perhaps think about the externalization of the borders. Who should be doing this work? Who should be the one who does the filter or the blogging? Perhaps the people of Venezuela who are connected here on the call could shed some light. And now, Martin Baro, there's so much to read. I had only sent one paper because I tried to be more moderate with your time, but if you want more readings, I can send more links and some other papers because there's so much richness, much wealth. And there are some very good videos of him speaking. And the clips look very old because it's from the 1980s, but it's worth watching. So perhaps I can send them to Asia. But if you look Ignacio Martin Baro on YouTube, there's one particular clip that is really good. That conference, that's when he spoke about the model of the liberation social psychology. It is also in the writing, but it's always nicer, I believe, to listen to his words. It's very encouraging, very inspirational. And then the question about the migrant who became a human rights defender, the question there, it is a complex matter. Why? Because the structures of violence that we spoke about at the macro level, remember the images that I showed about the iceberg and the tree, they're not alien to us, they're not far away from us. And they are not foreign to social structures, even families, even social NGOs. You'll find the concentric circles of the psychosocial approach, the dynamics of violence and oppression that happen in all human relationships. They also happen in our everyday lives. And they also bias and determine the way in which we relate to others. And it's very clear when we think about the relationships we have with our significant others or gender violence. The whole system is built from a heteropatriarchal perspective, and it is something that is filtered, and it is in the backbone of gender violence. Men who exercise oppression and violence against their partners, and in the case of the NGOs, the collectives, not even within human rights organizations, are free from them. There's also gender violence within human rights defenders. It's in our DNA. That is why we have this urgent need to look at ourselves and do a lot of reflection about what we do within organizations and question what we do and why we do it and how we are doing the thing we're doing, because nobody is exempt, nobody's free from the patriarchal mandates. They are unconscious. The oppressions, they happen because of class reasons, because of gender reasons, of racism, or gender reasons, or sexuality, etc. So if somebody has tried to do this work, which is a very difficult work to do, by the way, you must have found that sometimes you hit against a hard brick wall when you realize that it happens to everyone. It happens to everyone everywhere. It's in the bone marrow of our institutions and organizations and our NGOs and collectives and families. Structural violences happen everywhere. So what I would say is that, well, if this person has made the decision to distance him or herself and do the defense from somewhere else, that's also sometimes a solution. But hopefully there might be an opportunity to have a conversation, difficult conversation with the people he or she is working with. That's very valuable, because speaking about the mental health of organizations, it is quite a subject and it's very necessary. For that, we need to ask ourselves, even if we don't want to see or acknowledge that there's structural violence in our daily lives, there is, and we should try to find it. Okay, a couple more questions. The question of the $64 million, how could we incorporate the psychosocial approach in the migration policies? And the second one, when you speak about gender violence or violence against women, what is the Latin American country that creates more violence for women? Which is the best country for women to live in? Wow, those questions, oh my God, I don't have a lot of time. But anyway, I'll try to be as succinct as possible. Let's see. The psychosocial perspective in the migration policy, well, complex situation, but we had said that the psychosocial approach cannot be separated from our human rights stand, our positioning. And so to begin with, we would have to guarantee that that migration policy does honor and respect human rights. That is the very first step, very big one, by the way. The truth is that it is a complex thing. To dive in geopolitics, because think about Mexico, for instance. Of course, in order for us to be able to have a migration policy that truly guarantees human rights, migrants, well, the policy would have to stop responding to political interests of the US. We should not be the filter of the US anymore, because we are the goalkeeper. To the extent in which the migration policy in Mexico is following the US instructions, human rights will never be respected. So we cannot speak about the social approach, because it's only makeup, disguise, cover. If in a migration center you send a psychologist and with that you believe that the psychosocial has been respected, but do nothing else, it's a fraud. The institutions, they are only taking care of the appearances. No, I have hired 10 psychologists in my migration detention center, so there you have it. It's covered. That's only makeup. It's only a fake cover, because at the core of the practices of the institutions or the organizations, human rights are still being violated because we're following the instructions of the powerful. And the second one about women, dear God, well, I cannot think about the statistics because there's not clarity. And I'm only speaking about the context that I know of, which is Mexico and Central America. And what I know is that it's so scary and it is chilling. The amount of feminicides that are happening in this country. Because in Mexico, according to official figures, Asia, I don't remember if it's one woman who's killed every hour or one a day, but it's incredibly concerning. Of the things we know of, because there are many other killings, many other femicides, or as we call them in Mexico, feminicides, it's tremendous. So this is only for us to get an idea of how critical violence against women is in Mexico and Central America. I don't have memorized the figures, but they're Very concerning, very chilling. What is the best country for women? Oh God, cannot think of one. But once again, the subject is not to try and find the best country. Let's all move to Sweden and there we will be safe. That's not what this is about. It's not possible. It's not realistic. Why should we hide and run away from one place to another to find the only Salvation Island available? No, the idea is that we need to change our own societies so that this stops happening. We need to change our men so no more women are killed like that, and we have to run away to find a place that seems safer for women because there's none. One last round of questions. If I don't read all of your questions, don't worry. At the end, we'll have a final Q&A, and we'll have Dr. Achotegui and Ana Elena answering questions. A very beautiful question here. It's a reaffirmation, a question. So the psychosocial approach, is it searching to reconstruct the social we from its essence? That's the first question. And how can we change the hate speech against migrants, not only individually, but politically and from all levels? How do we break those violent relationships and discourses? Okay, I'll start with the last question. That's also another very big question to ask. I think that the task starts individually within each one of us. We should truly and honestly question what is the role we play, the understandings we have, our gut reactions when we speak, when we hear about someone who's different from me, who comes from a different reality from the other. For instance, the other day we were talking with a friend and we spoke about the case of a migrant woman who had recently arrived at Mexico with a baby, a newborn. The first comment that he says, that bursts out of his mouth, what is she thinking coming here with a baby? So evidently we got into a fight because of this, but what is this speaking about? Because here the question is not what's in her mind to come here, because for those of us who have been pregnant, for those of us who are mothers, we know that the last thing you would like to do when you're pregnant, when you have a newborn baby, is to go into a new adventure. Let's move to another country without a penny in my pocket and see what I'll eat or where I'll sleep. That sounds like fun. Of course, that's the last thing you would like to do. The only thing you want is to nest, to have safety. So the question is not, what was she thinking traveling with a newborn baby? The question is, what is she going through? Because in spite of having a newborn baby, she had to run away, to flee, to find a safer place. Because imagine having to face the uncertainty of starting afresh with a newborn baby. Why is she doing that? What is she suffering? So if in our relationships with migrants, when I hear people, when I read in the news about the caravan of migrants that's coming to Mexico, the first thing that I see is, why are they coming? They shouldn't be coming here. Why are they here again? What are they trying to get? We didn't invite them. We don't want them here. That is the first thing you read, you hear. My first gut reaction is, what are they thinking? Then we all should stop and ask ourselves, especially if I'm working with migrants, why did I choose this line of work if I have this question in my mind? What is it that I believe? How am I judging migrants? And who am I to judge the behavior of others I know nothing about. So the first one is to review your own personal views and belief systems. What is the first thing that comes to mind? Even if I don't say it out loud, but if you're getting that gut reaction, see what it means. What are you believing? When you hear about a case, when somebody speaks about migrants, what are my gut reactions? What am I believing? Because that would be a very long, important work to do to begin with. But then the second thing would be you need to choose your news outlets and the things you share. Now with the pandemic, we have seen fake news everywhere and how they're wreaking havoc, and how the sharing of news that promote fear, what they are causing, what they're triggering others, and how they're steering the collective rejection and the collective fear. So I do believe that there was a comment I heard that everything starts with putting yourself in the shoes of others. Yes, a basic ingredient in our relationships, it has to be empathy, obviously. If I'm not capable of understanding the reasons behind why this woman would have to uh, leave a country and feel the pain of this woman, if I cannot feel that, I cannot see that, what am I doing saying that I am a psychosocial actor, agent, and that I want to improve migration policies if I cannot have that compassion? And now the other question, the psychosocial approach, is it meant to reconstruct relationships from the essence? Yes, that's another way to put it. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. We're going to have a small break, a 5-minute break for us to stretch our legs. And then we'll go back to the second part of today's class, which will be taught by Dr. Achotegui. We are back, as we have mentioned, aside from having this tradition of having him as a speaker year after year. The Atenea Network is also a part of the diploma course. 3 years ago, he was here. I think it was the year of the big earthquake. But anyway, wherever he is around the world, he's always teaching this class. So we thank you for that. So the floor is all yours, Dr. Achotegui, for the second part of this session. So may I share the screen now? Do you want me to share my screen or your screen? Well, let's see if I can do that. Don't forget, you need to zoom out. Is that working well? Great. Okay, so first of all, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world, good morning. For me, it is a great honor to still be a part of this effort, of this diploma course. I would like to thank Asiadet, Embio, Liliana, and the whole group of the organizers of this beautiful activity, something that is useful for everyone because we all see the evolution and reflect upon new things. So it's a constant exercise of us growing together. The presentation before mine, Diana Navarro's conference, was extremely interesting. She was able to clearly explain different, very important ideas of psychosocial interventions. So I'm going to try to give it a more theoretical, if you may, perspective, but it goes well with what she said. It's also interesting for us, because obviously when you go into theory, it can become a bit more complex. It could also be controversial, which is a good thing to debate things. So let us start with a more global perspective. because as we had said, there are many dimensions to consider. The main idea here is to speak about biopolitics and mental health. So this is the order of my presentation, my agenda. You don't need to memorize everything, but anyway, it's just to give some structure. Let us begin what this is all about, the definition of biopolitics. This term was coined by this person. He was a philosopher and a politician from Sweden, and he contributed to with many concepts. The idea of biopolitics was one of them, but the person who developed the concept in a more important way was an author you have all heard of, Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault spoke about many different things, and we will be referring to him constantly because he is a very important reference in the subject matter. He realizes that the body and the mind, by extension in a broader sense of the word, the body is also part of politics. Politics is not something that is only that the doctors, the physicians should look into, but rather there's a social dimension of the body, a political dimension of the body, and we could also say that the body is the raw material that is used by the system. In all of our concepts we have around mental health pathologies, it goes beyond social matters, they are political. There's this idea of biopolitics. So obviously, the response of the subject should be an emancipating one. When we realized how much we've been manipulated and controlled by those ideas of others, and that is what's behind the debate. Foucault has written different papers where he speaks about biopolitics, presents certain quotes, certain definitions that he has given, and here are some reference books. But anyway, he stated that starting of the 18th century, there was a change in our societies, and we got this concept of speaking about bodies and health and sexuality, disease, pathology. It all became part of a political agenda in the 18th century. That's when those questions started to be explored, along with liberal ideas, political changes that were taking place at that time that created the emergence of health understanding, health concepts, and politics, its relation to politics. So here are some quotes for you to read. But anyway, it all helps us see that everything that's related to things that we see from a technical perspective as psychologists, sexologists, psychiatrists, there's a dimension that goes beyond the technical professional sphere of our action. Here we're dealing with situations that go beyond many things that we believe, and that's the interesting idea that I believe that Foucault has brought to the table. Foucault says that with liberalism, that's when this idea of biopolitics became consolidated, and sometimes he also calls it bioterms, biopolitics. There are many terms that biopower, he's referring basically to the same thing. He says that before the time of biopolitics, there was another era which he called the anatomopolitics era. That was an era in which the system was less complex, it was simpler, and with biopolitics, things got more complicated. Power, the state started manipulating subjects even more. There's a more subtle type of manipulation, a more subtle type of control that is exerted over the masses through exploitation, physical, mental, emotional exploitation of citizens. So he even says that biopolitics refers to groups. It is a subject that is much wider. It refers to whole populations. The states started having global ideas of citizens But anatomopolitics was something that was more individual. It was an era that was before biopolitics and before the development of societies, and that individuals are unpredictable, but groups are not unpredictable. Groups can very well be studied. The study of groups is easier if you made that the study of individuals.
And little by little, they started with this idea of biopolitics. Biopolitics has to do with birth, with prevention, and the prevailing of diseases, sexuality, abortions. These are topics that we are continuously being talked about, but that are Foucault has been introducing by the 18th century, but that are important to be understood or analyzed a little bit more because they are the political philosophy behind everything that we do. We do things, but behind that, we have certain values and concepts as well as ideologies that we need to follow. And this is what biopolitics wants to present. I think that with this, we can then talk about a basic definition that biopolitics, everything has to do with well-being, with health, and that has to do with things that go beyond technique, but with the values and everything that we need to develop for this. And through psychology and through psychiatry, we think about technologies and very professional state of minds that have been developed at the operational level, but behind it, there's many philosophical and conceptual aspects. Psychiatry, for example, 40 years ago were providing electroshocks to homosexuals. So what kind of ideology was behind that, and how has that changed that we're no longer doing that? So it's very interesting to reflect on the values and the concepts that are behind each one of the practices that we have developed at the psychological and psychosocial level. Biopolitics also revalues the body, considers that philosophy had devalued this aspect of the body with all this idea that the mind is superior than the body. And biopolitics also mentions the importance of everything that has to do with the body. And sexuality, that's one of the topics that I'm going to try to talk about. It goes way beyond what zoologists or psychiatrists or psychologists think about. It is related to values, it is related to cosmodiction. So it has a more in-depth definition than the one that we present sometimes. So, very quickly, and in order to talk about biopolitics and to understand what we're talking about, let's talk about mental health. And let's analyze this idea of the concept of a mental disorder, which has changed throughout history. So, it's not something that can be easily related with a technical aspect or an operational aspect. It has a much more philosophical dimension, a philological dimension, and this is what biopolitics refers to. And Foucault provided interesting information to this regards because he bases everything on data. He's not only a philosopher who reflects on things and presents his own ideas, very complex ideas of reality. He also has data, hard data. He is a person that bases everything. He was a person that bases everything on the research he carried out. We know he died some years ago. And so he did everything based on facts. And he was carrying out the, his investigations in the University of Uppsala, the best center for psychiatry and psychiatric research in the world. And there he realized that the idea that we have for a mental disorder is something that is very old and is very specific. We think that it's like that and it's always been like that. But if we go back in history, we've seen that this has changed throughout it. So he did his PhD thesis based in a book called The History of Craziness in the Classical Era, where he started analyzing the changes of what mental health the mental health topic was throughout history. So, based on that data that he has, as I said, he's an empirical researcher, and he states that during the Middle Ages, craziness was an ironic reflection of a person. It was a critical vision of the world, a reflection of the world. And he talks about the ship and all the group of people who were there, the ship of the crazy people, a group of people that were outside the society, but that were also considered the pilgrims looking for a reason and looking for the reason of the world, representing the conjunction between order and chaos. During the Renaissance, craziness was considered a comprehensive human phenomenon. Today, we consider it as something distorted, as something that is strange or something that has been broken. But in the Renaissance, they considered madness in a different way. And this is very easy to prove. You know, we can see that in Shakespeare's works and Cervantes' works, where they talk about madness in a different way than what we have to date. Actually, it was the 400th anniversary of the death of Cervantes and Shakespeare. And it's interesting to see and reflect back on what they thought madness was at that moment, you know, and how relevant these people were, you know, in that era, both Cervantes and Shakespeare. For example, if we analyze Cervantes, Cervantes said that madness had to do with going beyond things, of talking about more complex type of functioning. So the question would be, were Cervantes and Shakespeare so mistaken on human nature? Or what has happened in the last 400 years? Have we really seen any progress or any changes? Well, Cervantes, as we all know, he talks about Don Quixote, and that Don Quixote is about madness. And it's madness in a very creative way. It's not madness as what we have today, you know, as something that is very specific and that cannot be presented. No, Don Quixote is actually a criticism of the whole world. It's a vision that analyzes things more in depth of what they and analyzes what people are doing. In this case, for example, we have Don Quixote and Sancho Panza talking, and he says, "Don't die, because the greatest madness a man can do in life is to let himself die without anything else, without anybody killing them. Don't be lazy. Get up out of that bed and let's go to the fields, you know." And it's basically telling him, invent yourself your own reality and don't let yourself die. So, you know, so he presents madness as a choice there, as presenting a different idea. He says the greatest madness is to die of pity. So what happens is that Don Quixote was very sad, and he becomes then Don Quixote de la Mancha, uh, who went out to the field and with a huge amount of happiness, and as a knight and a whole gentleman, and he was happy. You could see it, everything through the horse, even, and how he became this gentleman and this knight for everybody. So we're talking about that was in literature, but that turned that madness into something positive. So it's interesting to see these other points of view of madness. There are many texts of Cervantes that talk about it. We're not going to go in depth into each one of them, but it's very interesting. But it can help us as a point to reflect on. You know, madness is considered here as something positive. Actually, there is an area where Don Quixote makes himself mad. You know, even though they said he was already mad, that he becomes himself, he makes himself even madder. You know, and they ask him, but what are you doing? And he says, oh, that's the point. You know, that is that the most important thing, my friend Sancho, is to just become mad and do crazy things without anybody understanding what I'm doing, so that they can ask themselves, oh, what is he doing? Is he crazy? So it's a different idea of madness than what we have today. There's been many works done analyzing this, but as Cervantes says, Don Quixote is a mad person that is full of lucid moments. But they do specify something. They do say that craziness is important. And this is also present in Shakespeare's works. You know, if we go to Hamlet, we can see how Polonio says to Hamlet, well, this happy turns are very frequent in madness, you know, when in the state of reason and health, you may not achieve them. So we see that there's another idea here of what mental health and madness is. It's very difficult to explain this with the time that we have. All of this is published in my website, and if you're interested, you can analyze it more in depth. There are many examples in the works of people that are so important, like Cervantes and Shakespeare, and that present other ideas of madness. In King Lear, for example, they talk about madness also, but there they acknowledge also the values that the madness presents because it presents things that other people cannot see, things that are positive. You know, we have here the text in English from where the translation came from. So Foucault tells us that madness is a human comprehensive phenomena, and it cannot be considered as something strange that would only appear once in a lifetime, you know? And this is an important reflection to make to understand what we think about when we talk about madness. So Foucault continued studying madness throughout history, and he saw that throughout history, the concept of madness changes. And then in the 18th century, there was a different idea of what madness was. So we have here the idea, and I'm going a little bit fast because we don't have a lot of time, but we have the idea that the mad person is somebody considered as a person that has no control over his emotions. And that's where we have these changes. And when we have a change of analysis of all the social functioning during the illustration, the Enlightenment era, and here we see that mad persons are dominated by their impulses. And so, what they're trying to do is to get that person out of those impulses only and to come back to reason. And that is something that Foucault also criticizes. He actually criticizes Pinel's ideas that was breaking the chains of all the mad people who were in the crazy house in Paris. He says he removes those chains, the physical chains, but he gave them other chains that he told them that they need to behave following the bourgeois morality. And so those are chains that do not let them be free. But this is another idea, you know, of how there's been different interpretation of madness throughout history. I'm going, as I said, a little bit fast because I want to really get to all of it. You know, in England, there's another psychiatrist called Tuke who also did something very similar, talking about the bourgeois morality. And then in the 19th century, the madman becomes a mental illness. Madness becomes a mental illness. And here we have the figure of the physician who has the authority of removing this person from society to control it because they have a disorder. And so here, for example, why Foucault asks himself, why does the physician has that power? Who gave that power to that physician? You know, and the answer that he provides is that somebody who has social control because a mad person can give feelings or provide things that are not adequate for the social context, and that's why that person has to be alienated or canceled or changed. You know, but Foucault is asking himself, you know, why does a physician, why can he decide what is reasonable and what is not reasonable? Who gave him the authority? You know, we know the works of Foucault, so we have interesting responses there. And this idea on how the idea of madness has changed throughout time is very interesting. Foucault now is the expert, is the one who regulates morality. The doctor is the one who does that, but always following the model of the dominant society. Those are the ones providing that power. And we have the case of homosexuality, for example. Homosexuality was considered a mental disorder until we have all of these protests and we have the case of Stonewall, and that forces the Psychiatrist Convention in 1973 to consider it as not no longer as a mental disorder. So we see how ideological aspects are always having an influence on psychological aspects, and all of this power comes through biopolitics and its social aspects. So I want to say again, I'm sorry I cannot see all of this in detail, but let's talk about this reflection that Foucault has on psychiatry. It says, I had followed also the psychopathology studies, and this discipline was not teaching anything really important. Why is it then that with such a lack of knowledge, we have so much power? You know, because we are based on what a society wants, and that's the most important reflection that we need to do here, because we are basing everything on society, and that's what Foucault was also stating at then. And he also says that it's not the same being different than being sick, because the system may consider that any person who is not adequate for its own interests or the interests of the system has to be receive treatment or be corrected in some way, and it wouldn't be really something adequate, in this regard. Here we have a Romanian dissident who was diagnosed with reivindicative delirious psychosis based on the system that they had, which is fully totalitarian. And if somebody didn't agree with them, they said they were crazy. So this is an extreme, and this is like a very specific case of what we're presenting. So this is Foucault's statement. I'm not going to talk about that because I've already mentioned we have other things that we should mention. And all of this information, once again, is in my website, and there are other publications that you can also obtain. Now, all of this also coincide with what the evolutionist psychologist talks about. They think that there's this huge psychodiversity, and that the social model is looking for some sort of model, where we all follow the same model. Those that are healthy follow that model, and the others are not because they're not following the same structure of the system. And that everybody should be very critical of the power given by society, and all the physicians involved in psychiatry should be very critical to that, because we have a lot of power provided by society, and sometimes with a lot of interests involved that are not healthy interests. So Foucault presents that there's three stages of madness. First, as a mystery, there's a criticism, something tragical of the world, then the moral issue, and lastly, as a disease. We say that today is no longer considered a mental disease, it's a biological disease. I mean, we've obtained a lot of information, and this has reduced madness to something that has to do with a neuronal aspect. So it's a quite complex topic. This also leads us to what we call post-psychiatry. It's not only to listen to the voice of the expert, we have to listen to all the voices, the voice of the person who has a psychological issue. We have to listen to the voices of the group, of the community. I think that there's an overvaluation right now of the voice of the expert only, and we need to follow all of this philosophical expert, and consider that the voice of the expert should not be the only voice that we listen to. And this leads us to a psychiatrization of our everyday life, and considering this DSM that started with 100 disorders in the 50s, and we're almost at 400 disorders right now. So it has had an exponential growth, and it includes many diseases that were previously not being considered, and they were considered like part of the reality of their life. And now we have a disorder or a chart for each one of them to analyze all the different levels. And so here, in this current social context, we can see that there is a tendency to turn many elements in psychiatric terms. The DSM is a diagnostic and statistical model used that helps us to classify in a very important way um, all these disorders. And madness is dealt here in a very mechanical way, fact that a person believed himself that he was Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. Well, it has a lot to do with geography, with the life of that people, and it's not something that is just related with a failure or a neuronal failure or issue that they have in their brain. So we're really simplifying everything regarding mental life, and the disorders. And Foucault criticized European psychiatry. He didn't know about the American psychiatry, who had even gone further beyond that. Beyond that, the European psychiatry were considering sadness as a mental disorder. You know, things from literature were considered disorders. And, depression, for example, has been considered as part of the diagnosis, but this has been in recent years. And we're talking about the main aspects. We're becoming pride as a narcissist disorder, anger as an impulse disorder, shyness as a social phobia disorder. So we're really becoming, and we're making everything become a disorder. And this is part of turning all the issues and all the social difficulties that a human being can have into a model that can be consumed, or you can say what you can have or you cannot have. So I want to finish this part. We have many other parts. I think this is a very long part. So I just want to end up by saying that what we find, or what we call mental health, is an ideological and a technical aspect. Today we've had a lot of neo-foculations. This author that I'm showing right now is one of the most important ones. Is a Korean German professor in Munich, and what he says, I mean, we're not living at Foucault's era that was quite repressive. The disorders that we have are because of tiredness, because of excessive positivity, and not because they want to repel anything negative. And so this is what Foucault was specifying. He was seeing how the different functions were changing, and just as he described it, his ideas have also changed to date. The disciplinary society that Foucault included hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, jails, manufacturing areas that are no longer part of a society today. Today, we call what we find in society our gyms, our huge shopping malls, but this is not a disciplinary society anymore. It's a proficient society. We have here an example of people trying to relax themselves of an era of something that's quite stressful, in an environment that's quite stressful. And the disciplinary society was creating these mad people and criminals. Today, the society is creating depressive people and failed people, and that's what this author is specifying. So it's part of an interesting case that we should analyze. So now we're going to talk about something else. We're going to talk about sexuality. And I think that we've talked about madness, and we've seen that madness is clearly related with ideological elements aside from technological issues. But sexuality is the same thing. Sexuality is not something that only sexologists should talk about, or doctors or psychologists. No, it has a huge ideological and philosophical aspect that needs to be analyzed also. And maybe the topic that questions the model of dominant sexuality is the queer movement. Queer is an English word that has to do with something that's abnormal, that's strange, that's crooked, but that has been reconverted and now used in a positive way, in a way of a model, which was in the past something very negative. It's a quite complex movement, a movement that has a lot of debate still, but that re-specifies what sexuality is. For example, in Sherlock Holmes, they use this word queer, referring to something strange, to something that is not following a standard and not in the same way used today. And there were three biopolitical currents that talk about this queer theory. We had Foucault, who Foucault was also ahead of his time in this regard, and he had a series of reflections regarding sexuality. Then we have brutal Marxism, that is one of the main branches of psychoanalysis, and that also was way ahead of what we're seeing today. And lastly, the critical theory, that is a current theory and that has been worked by many authors. Foucault, as we said, is one of the precursors of the queer movement. Also, psychiatry was part of that, but Foucault mentioned all of this about sexology, and he actually tried to write the history of sexuality. He only wrote 4 books. This was the first book that talks about the will of knowing, and this book talks about the main concepts of the model. He died by the 4th book because of AIDS during the AIDS pandemics in the 80s, the 70s, the 80s, and that's when he died because of it. So he was unable to finish the last book, but he presented things that were quite interesting. He says that sexuality is a power device, it's linked to the power models, and is very typical of a full modernity. Is a complex web of conventions, practices, and knowledge that look for how to govern the bodies, their behaviors, and the subjectivities through the definition and imposition of sexual identities. And these sexual identities will act as a biopolitical operator. So basically, he said this 50 years ago, and it's not the same as saying this today, as he was way ahead of his time in this type of debates that today are every day occurring. He could analyze this very in depth. And so what happened? He studied history again, and he saw that throughout humanity's history, there's a huge different ways of analyzing and talking about sexuality. So the model that we might have today does not have to be absolute or against its nature. All the information that we have show that this is not like that. And he tried to go into these topics much more in depth and what its relationship with madness was. Another important theory here with sexuality were Freudo-Marxism. The psychoanalysis and Marxism were 2 macro theories that have like a bad iron health. They're very bad theories, but they always come back because they're like iron made, and they are always talking about the issues and the problems, but they do have very important elements that should be analyzed. And every time there's a crisis, they come back again. These 2 authors, Freud and Marx, have been main actors for the analysis of human societies. There's several schools that are very interesting from the biopolitical point of view and that analyze sexuality in that way. And Freud had the intuition that the experience was much more, it went much more than just a mental issue. And he doesn't want to go that far, so he doesn't stop specifying everything that he presented. And these are materialistic theories that have a very common point. They base everything. It did not come did not come from elements that are outside of nature. And William Reich was quite radical, but he went all the way in the analysis of sexuality, everything that had to do with sexuality. And he considered that there is a huge sexual repression, and this sexual repression is linked to the social model, closely linked to it. And he tries to also connect Freudism and Marxism, and he is expelled from the 2 models. In 1933, he's expelled from the Psychoanalytical Society from the Marxism Party because what he was trying to do was something that wasn't clearly accepted at that moment. He was expelled from the Communist Party because he questioned the hierarchy, and that created a lot of issues. And because by valuing everything that was personal, then he's weakening all of that. And he's expelled from the psychoanalytical aspect because he's not giving the importance to sexuality, that he's a Bolshevik. And so this is an example of how these pioneers also faced a lot of issues in order to be accepted in the world.
Wilhelm Reich thinks that capitalism is taking advantage of how sexuality is treated to reign over people, because this repressed sexuality creates people who are passive, obedient, without energy. And that is very important for the maintenance of the system. The idea of having heterosexual learnings and everything. So he has a very radical positioning during a time at the end of his life. He lived a very complicated situation, but his contributions are quite critical because he was able to dwell into the social model and relating it to sexuality. He would ask, there are certain psychological elements that block the class consciousness. Why do we keep doing irrational things? Why do people let themselves be stepped over? So it has to be with the ruling of bodies, the ruling of the minds through sexuality. He believes that the sexual revolution is one against capitalism because it goes against discipline, authority, and it's not subjecting pleasure. He was a true precursor of the patriarchal opposition. He had to do with birth control, and he said that women should had to have babies for the Reich. So he analyzed the society of his time, and he was a precursor of the development of many newer ideas about sexuality. Another very important author is Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse was a philosopher by training, and he started with the Frankfurt School of Thought. He went to the States. He developed his theory there. He is a philosopher of the 1968 revolt, the uprising. And he spoke about the fact that something that Freud, he also criticized Freud, that he was not radical enough in the analysis of how important sexuality is. But he realizes that this is not the right capitalism. This one has been evolving during the 60s and 70s, and this advancement has caused the triggering of new mechanisms for more sophisticated types of manipulation of the masses that are still repressed, but now through a society of consumption that is aspirational. And he analyzes the fact that there's still exploitation and oppression through the repressed sexuality, but people do not realize that is happening because of how they have been tampered with, because of how the manipulation of capitalism has taken place. Marcuse is a very interesting author in the way in which he criticizes sexual repression. And he considered that capitalism regulates the pleasure lifestyles and that there should be a sublimation that is not repressive in nature. As Reich had said before him, repression cannot be a solution, but rather sexuality has to be expressed. Marcuse traveled to the States. He participated in the Berkeley uprising of 68, one that was much liberal than the one in Paris. Paris is more Puritan. The US took it further beyond. And the sexual revolution was practiced more intensely in the US than in Europe. A more recent author, Ernesto Laclau, he is a person from Argentina. He's Marxist, post-Marxist, and he criticizes the essentialism in psychoanalysis and Marxism using the Gramsci theories of hegemony. He says that the political ideas have to be rethought so that people can understand them. They have to be translated into each context because the message has to change according to the context so that people can understand that this is the Antonio Gramsci idea who he follows. So this author took elements from psychoanalysis with elements of philosophy, Lacanian psychoanalysis basically, and he spoke of different floating significance that are the ones that can be used to give meaning so that people can relate to them and cause a social change. More recent developments include authors like Slavoj Zizek. He is a professor of Slovenia. He is developing different theories, but it's still something that's being created. And Judith Butler obviously has to be talked about. Judith Butler criticizes taking elements from psychoanalysis and Lacanian theory. He criticizes the idea of gender, sexuality. He believes that all of that has to be redefined. Those are socially constructed categories and they have to be debated. So we find that sexuality is also biopolitical, that goes beyond the specific operative techniques that happen within a doctor's office, the Boston Jones model, whatever. There's class, there's etiology, there are many things to be considered and redefined. Judith Butler has been able to go very deep into the analysis and to update things that have been said before, but she made them relevant. But this is a very complex, open, live debate. It's not over yet. Now, let's speak about migration and racism. This is a subject that I will speak about in another session as well, but anyway, it has to be framed within biopolitics. This is the last part of my presentation. We go back to talk about Foucault. Foucault, he has the concept of biopolitics that was introduced regarding racism. Foucault realizes that the idea of race is used by the power to rule over others. It was the 18th century, the 19th century, the time of the great empires. So racism was necessary because there were social, economic power systems involved. For him, racism was one of the core elements of biopolitics. He classified society in different groups so that one group can rule over other, certain rules have to take place. His ideas are very closely related to the function of power, control, domination, human groups that are considered as dangerous, that cannot be controlled, that have no rights, etc. Foucault used to say that power acted as a disciplinarian, excluding the crazy and the people imprisoned. In his time, the drama of migration was not so extensive as it is nowadays, but now undocumented migrants are the ones who are living very extreme situations as a group that is radically excluded from society. And here we should also speak about the Ulysses syndrome as a situation in which there's social exclusion that is radical with a psychological component of suffering that is extremely large, chronic stress, and from a psychological perspective, but also with a social perspective, there's a social exclusion and exploitation component to it. So this is also related to biopolitics. How is it that migration and racism are also connected? And how they are created to respond to the interest of a socioeconomic model that uses people for its own goals. Migrants are used as cheap labor or even slave labor. This is also part of the framework that can be called biopolitics. We should also speak about Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist from the French colonies, Martinica. He suffered a lot because he was a Black person. He was discriminated against severely. He became a theoretician against colonialism from the perspective of psychiatry. He wrote many books, The Dam of the Earth, Dark Skin, White Mask. He is quite the reference of the anti-colonialism school of thought from the perspective of psychiatry. So we can say that this is also biopolitics. Frantz Fanon has a quote that summarizes everything. A Black person is not a man, a Black person is a Black man. So the stigma of racism is acting upon the psyche of the masses. And we see this with migrants, yes, but you can also see it here with the minorities in all communities that are suffering from racism. And to conclude, to wrap it up, a reflection about COVID-19, the pandemic. As we had said at the beginning of the session, we see that many messages are being sent out that chill out, everything's okay, don't worry, but those messages are sold as official messages, but it's just to create the illusion for you to be able to cope, to be able to survive, not because there's a truth. So, okay, yes, I'm going to chill out, I'm going to relax, but the risk is still there. The risk is that we're being fooled, we're being lied to, because it is okay to relax if you're safe, not when you're not safe. If the earth is shaking under your feet, you should be very much concerned. You should do something to look after yourself. So, unfortunately, the social model is one in which people are not invited to have a critical understanding of the situation, but rather we're giving messages of nothing's happening, everything's fine. So there's a denial. There is a way in which we're becoming numb of the implications of the situation, and therefore we are not able to deal with them correctly, because this is not a time to be chilling out. It's a time to be careful and work with many things. As Noemi Klein has said, catastrophe situations are related to great social changes where rights and freedoms are negotiated, are at stake. Right now, there's a big risk for this to become, once again, the danger. So it is very important for us to think about what is the mental health model we're following. Biopolitics is something we should take into consideration. We have to be critical with the messages that authorities give us to understand what's at stake, what they're trying to sell, so that we are within what the authorities consider to be something that's desirable for them, for the social model, regardless of whether or not it's good for the citizens. So this is why it is very important to be very critical, to be able to think independently and come up to our own conclusions and our understandings of reality. So here, once again, there's the idea that we need to reflect upon the idea of mental health in this context of the pandemic, because it can be used in a way that is responsible and that can help us cope, that is responsible. But it's like the Titanic. We are listening to the orchestra play while the boat is sinking. And we're not realizing all of the complexities of what we're living. And so mental health now has to be a very proactive, very reflective concept, and not something that it's only about relaxing and numbing yourself and distract yourself and don't look at the situation. I believe that's something that is important for us to take into consideration, to have in mind. The last text is found in my blog. It's a public blog where you'll find different papers of the what I have discussed. And in order to summarize everything that I have said, this definition of biopolitics is everything that is biological and psychological that is transformed into a way in which people are used for exploitation. The system uses it, uses all of those elements for their own benefit. And all of those categories that we use, the technical names we give to mental deviations or things, all of those categories have a philosophical, theoretical, ideological background that we should be very careful of using label. We have to be very reflective. That is what I bring to your attention. It's not that we need to just put on a happy face in the face of trouble, but rather we need to find a way to cope and to get rid of the things that oppress us or can exploit us. You will find many texts in my blog in case you would like to learn more. And if somebody wants to ask me a question directly, here's my contact data. Send whatever you would like to comment on, or follow me on my social media. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, doctor. Thank you very much, because, well, anyway, it's Spain where you're at right now. It's midnight for you, so let's try to help you expedite the matter. He is a very kind person. It's 1 a.m. for him.